Getting a really good fix in a dot and dab wall can be quite tricky, especially if you're aiming for a hollow area. So I've got a little trick that I use all the time, which requires no special fixings, which means whether you're going for screws or expanding anchors, you can safely fix heavy items, including televisions. Walls like this that are a combination of blockwork covered in plasterboard are really common these days, and if you're going to live in a new build property, you're almost guaranteed to have a number of walls of this type of construction. And it's handy to understand, before we try to get a good fix in, what's behind this plasterboard. So join me in the workshop where I've made a mock-up of this type of wall. So this is my mock-up wall, and I know what you're saying, it's small, Stuart. It may be small, but I can show you everything I need to on a wall of this size. So the way we build walls like this these days is, first of all, we lay the blockwork, then the electrician comes along and fixes cables directly on the face of the blockwork that's then covered with either plastic or galvanised capping pieces. Now these pieces aren't there to protect the cable, they're just there to stop the cable getting covered by plaster when the plasterboard or drywall goes up. Eventually the plasterboard is stuck onto the wall with dots and dabs of plaster, hence dot and dab. And you can see the dabs of plaster here. I've stuck this plasterboard onto this blockwork. It's in both directions, so I've got one at the top here and one at the bottom. And if you're putting an 8x4 sheet of plasterboard onto blockwork, you only need a few dots and dabs, so it only really covers about 5% of the area. It's not very much at all. So the problem we have is, if we fix into an area that hasn't got a blob of plaster, there's a real risk when we tighten it up to try to get a firm fix in that we push that plasterboard in, bow it in, and sometimes you can even break it and break the front face as well, because there's nothing behind it. There's this 10-12mm gap, half-inch gap between the plasterboard and the blockwork. So let me put a fix in onto my little wall here and I'll show you what I mean. Although my little wall has a bigger percentage of dot and dabs compared to a standard wall because of the way I had to put it together, it is sometimes possible to strike lucky and end up fixing through a dab of plaster. But like most things, they never seem to be exactly where you want them. The raw plug I tap through the plasterboard into the block where it can grip properly. Leaving it on the plasterboard surface means half of it's in the plasterboard and half of it's in the void area, which will give you a very poor fix-in. So I've managed to completely smash this plasterboard, which isn't very clever. And I didn't actually put that much force into it really, I only used a normal screwdriver. And obviously, if I was putting this fix-in on to hang a photo or a picture on the wall, I would have stopped a lot earlier. You don't need to keep screwing until you get total destruction for something light like that. But we like to hang heavy things on our walls these days, like televisions and cantilevered shelves. So for those items, you do need a good fix-in. You need to be able to screw it in tight until you can't go any further. And obviously, if that's where a void is, you've got a major problem. It doesn't actually work at all. So there's a couple of items on the market that you can buy to sort of span this gap. And there's lots of YouTube videos out there showing you all the pros and cons and really advertising them as well. But I've got a different solution. You see, if we could fix through one of these dots or dabs, then we wouldn't have the same problem, because rather than having a void, we've got plaster behind the plasterboard. So it's really like fixing to a traditional wall. And before you start shouting at me through the computer, yes, I know, we don't know exactly where the dots and dabs are. And even if we did, they're not going to be where we want to put the fix in. So the solution is, if we're trying to fix something heavy to somewhere where we've got a void, let's fill the void. I'm going to be using a cartridge gun to push filler through a hole in the plasterboard into the void. To do this, you need a good tight seal between the nozzle of the cartridge gun and the plasterboard itself. So using an offcut of timber of roughly the same thickness as the plasterboard, I drill a hole with a medium-sized drill bit, then push a nozzle through as far as it will go, then mark the inside and trim the nozzle to length. I tidy up the plastic end where I cut it and check the fit. Using the same drill bit, I then drill a hole through the plasterboard, roughly where I want the fixing to be. So that's our hole prepared through the plasterboard. It doesn't have to go into the blockwork, it just has to go through the plasterboard here. And I've cut down a nozzle that actually matches this hole. So it actually stops at the back of the plasterboard. It can stop anywhere, it just doesn't want to be touching the blockwork because it's going to be difficult to get any material out. Now, it doesn't really matter what size hole we use. I've used an 8mm here just because I've got the bit here and it seems to work okay, but it doesn't really matter. As long as you can get this fairly tight fit into this hole, then you haven't got a problem. Now, for material, we have to be a little bit careful on what material we use. You see, you can't use material that comes out of a tube like this because it actually needs air to go hard. So if you're going to use polyfiller or anything like this, if you squirt a huge amount into here and it hasn't got enough air to make it go hard, it's still going to be soft for many days to come. So I've got here a little tester of two different types of material. The one on my right is this polyfiller type no nonsense plastering. The one on my left is a powdered format. This one comes from Screwfix, but polyfiller do the same sort of thing. It's a powder in here that you mix with water. I filled these two plastic bags with these materials 24 hours ago. So let's have a look to see what's happened since. So if we firstly look at the filler that I had to mix with water, this has gone hard. It's obviously gone hard. It's hydrated. The chemical in the filler has reacted with the water and gone hard, just like cement or plaster of Paris, to the point where I can now break it and it cracks. But if we look at the one out the cartridge, where the air hasn't got to it because it's in a plastic bag, this is still as soft and as runny as in the cartridge as well. So if you're going to use a filler like this out of a gun, it will eventually go hard as the plasterboard and the blockwork will suck some of the moisture out of it, the air will get to it, and after a few days it will be hard, but it might take a few days. So I'd highly recommend using a powder like this, that when you put water with it, it hydrates the powder, there's a chemical reaction that actually occurs, and this doesn't need to have any air to make it set. This more traditional powder-based filler is easy to mix, and if it's a bit runny then just add more filler, and the other way around, if it's too dry, add more water. It's very easy to adjust. I'm aiming here at a consistency that will easily spread into the void while not being too runny and move under gravity once it's in place. I'm thinking jam consistency, or jelly if you're American, rather than peanut butter. I load the filler into a plastic bag that I found just saves on cleaning the cartridge. This is easier if you've had some experience in icing cakes. The cartridge I'm using is an empty, reusable type that costs a couple of pounds, and it fits into a standard sealant or caulking gun and uses standard nozzles. I firmly push the nozzle into the hole in the plasterboard and push in the filler. While I've got the gun filled, I also take the opportunity back in the house to drill and fill a couple of holes for something important that I need to hang that's just turned up. Cleaning is straightforward, especially if you use a plastic bag in the tube. The rest of the material just washes away easily with water. So it's all fairly tidy until I had to clean up. Maybe that's why my wife doesn't like me cleaning up. Anyway, we're going to leave this overnight and come back to this tomorrow. So I've left this overnight to go off, and now I've got a solid piece of plaster between the plasterboard and the block work. I realised that I stopped when it sort of got to the surface here, and that meant that I've got like a 3-inch round, 75mm round blob of plaster. In reality, behind a wall, you could just keep going until the pressure got to the point where you couldn't force any more in. So what I did off camera was did the same down here. So I've got another blob. In reality, you could put one hole in the middle and just fill up this whole area. So if you've got two fixings to do that are fairly close to each other, you can just put a hole in the middle and just squirt enough in to support both of the fixings. So what I'm going to do now is I've got one of these garage type brackets. I'm going to fix this on and see if it can support my weight, which is quite a lot actually. That's quite a challenge. I'm not thin. Using this Marksman spray marker I find really handy for small holes like this. It's never let me down, but today it hasn't marked the lower hole, so I try again. I hate stickers. Can't believe they put stickers on every little item. Let's see if this works, shall we? To do this test, I'm using expanding anchor bolts rather than screws. These ones are 5mm by 90mm long and require a 12mm hole to be drilled. They start tightening once the anchor is pulled back to whatever is being fixed. So you wind until you feel resistance, which means they're starting to bite, and then keep going until tight. Compared to tightening the bracket over the void, there's absolutely no movement of the plasterboard now, which creates a very tight and secure fixing. I decide to mount the block and bracket for this test as close to the ground as possible, just in case the result doesn't go the way I think it will. So I've just rigged up my highly technical test equipment here. It's a couple of 3x2s and another one underneath the block just to make sure it's elevated, so all of my load actually goes on the hanger rather than the hanger being on the floor. So let's give this a go, shall we? Well, hey! Now that is a success. So after having said that you don't really need to do this with light pictures and paintings, I'm doing it with a light picture and painting. That's because this one particularly is quite important to me. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's given you some things to think about and maybe a different way of looking at attaching to dot and dab walls. Don't necessarily rush out and buy all the newest fixings that people want to sell you. I think sometimes it's good to look at things from a different angle, isn't it? And please check out our Patreon page where the membership is growing rapidly. It'd be good to see you over there and to have your support as well. Until next time.